The rancher gave his only blanket to two Apache sisters. By dawn, 300 warriors arrived. The winter that year was especially harsh. Snow had fallen earlier than usual, and icy winds swept across the plains with a bitter bite. Each morning, John would wake to a world blanketed in white, the cold creeping through the cracks of his old wooden walls and settling deep into his bones. His small herd of cattle, though hardy, had grown thin in the biting cold, and he spent hours trudging through the snow to make sure they had enough to eat. John was used to solitude. Living so far from the nearest town meant that neighbors were few and far between. Letters were rare and visits even rarer, but he didn't mind being alone most of the time. He had always felt a deep connection to the land, and in the quiet moments, when the wind howled outside and the snow shimmered in the sunlight, he felt a sense of peace that few others could understand. Still, the cold this year was something else entirely. It was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. He knew that even a few nights without proper warmth could leave a person weakened, and in the wilderness, weakness could be fatal. One evening, after tending to the cattle and making sure they were safely sheltered for the night, John returned to his cabin exhausted. The fire in the fireplace was dwindling, and he stacked more wood carefully, listening to the wind as it rattled the shutters. The cabin was small and simple, with only the bare necessities. There was a wooden table with a few chairs, a small cot against the wall, and a single, threadbare blanket that he had owned for years. That blanket was his most prized possession at the moment, for it was the only thing keeping him from shivering through the long, lonely nights. As he settled in, preparing for the night, John noticed movement through the frosted window. At first, he thought it might be a stray animal looking for shelter, but then he saw them clearly, two small figures huddled together against the wind. Their forms were barely distinguishable in the dark, but even from a distance, John could see that they were human and very young. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the danger they were in. Without hesitation, John grabbed his coat, threw on his worn boots, and stepped into the cold night. The snow crunched under his feet as he approached the girls, and they turned toward him with wide, frightened eyes. They were shivering violently, their thin clothing barely protecting them from the icy wind. Their cheeks were red and raw from the cold, and John could see the exhaustion written in their faces. They were clearly far from home, alone and vulnerable. "Hey there," John said softly, keeping his voice calm and gentle. He didn't want to startle them, only to offer comfort. "Come here. You'll catch your death out here." The girls hesitated at first, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But the cold was merciless, and John's kind tone seemed to reach them. Slowly they approached, and John wrapped them in the only blanket he had. The blanket was thin and worn, but he shared it willingly. As he pulled the girls close, he could feel their tiny bodies trembling. He adjusted the blanket around them, covering them as best he could. "Thank you," one of the girls whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. John smiled gently. "Don't thank me yet, just stay warm." He led them into the cabin, where the small fire was still burning weakly. He fed them some of the simple food he had on hand, bread and a little dried meat, and offered them water from a small pot he had heated. The girls ate quickly, hungrily, as if they had not had a proper meal in days. John watched them carefully, making sure they were safe and comfortable. As the night wore on, he learned a little about them. They were sisters, traveling alone after their village had been forced to leave due to hostile raids from other groups in the area. Their parents were nowhere to be found, and the girls had been trying to survive on their own. Their story was heartbreaking, but John did not dwell on it too long. He knew that right now, they needed warmth, food, and shelter more than anything else. He sat with them near the fire, telling them stories of the plains and of life on the ranch. He spoke of the cattle, the seasons, and the quiet beauty of the land. Slowly, the girls began to relax, their fear giving way to curiosity. They asked questions about the animals, about the snow, and even about John himself. In that small cabin, far from the world outside, a fragile trust began to form. The hours passed slowly, the wind outside never letting up. John wrapped the girls more securely in the blanket, even though it left him almost as cold as they had been. He told them he would take care of them for the night, that they would be safe as long as they stayed near the fire. The girls nodded, their eyes heavy with sleep. Eventually, they curled up together on the floor, leaning against each other for warmth, and John sat nearby, watching over them. Despite the freezing cold, John felt a strange sense of peace. He knew he had made the right decision, even if it meant he himself would shiver through the night. He looked at the two young faces, pale and tired, and felt a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He thought about the harsh winter, the lonely plains, and the dangers that lurked outside. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the shutters and making the trees groan under the weight of the snow. Inside, the cabin was small but alive with quiet warmth and the soft breathing of the girls as they slept. John knew that this night would be remembered, not for the cold or the hardships, but for the simple act of kindness that had brought two strangers into his home and offered them a chance at survival. Hours turned into morning, and the first light of dawn began to filter through the frost-covered windows. The girls stirred, their eyes blinking sleepily as they realized they had been safe all night. The blanket, now slightly worn from use, had done its job. The fire, which had flickered and almost died several times, had kept them warm enough to survive. John smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He had given them comfort when they had none, and in doing so he had discovered a courage and compassion within himself that he had never fully known. That morning, as the pale light of winter touched the plains, the girls and John shared a simple breakfast. The wind outside was relentless, but inside the cabin there was a sense of hope and new beginnings. The girls clutched the blanket that had saved them, and John knew that this night would forever remain etched in his memory. It was a night of survival, of trust, and of the quiet heroism found in small acts of generosity. John did not know what the future held, but he knew one thing. No matter the danger, no matter the cold, he would never regret giving his only blanket to two frightened sisters in need. In the harshness of the plains, amid the snow and the wind, he had learned that kindness, even in the smallest measure, could make all the difference in the world. And so, as the sun rose over the snow-dusted plains, John, the two sisters, and the old, worn blanket prepared to face whatever lay ahead, unaware that the choices made on this long, cold night would soon set in motion events that none of them could have imagined. The morning. Light fell softly through the frosted windows of John's cabin, casting a gentle glow across the small wooden floor. Outside, the plains were still covered in snow, stretching endlessly into the horizon, with the cold wind whispering through the barren trees. Inside, the cabin was warm with the fire that John had carefully kept alive through the night. The two sisters sat huddled on the blanket, rubbing their hands together to chase away the remaining chill. Their faces were pale but brighter than they had been the previous night, and there was a faint spark of hope in their eyes that hadn't been there before. John moved quietly, tending to the fire and preparing a simple breakfast. He offered them bread and some dried fruit he had kept for emergencies. The girls ate slowly, their movements careful, as if they were still unsure whether to trust him fully. Yet with each bite, they seemed to gain strength, and John could see the gratitude growing in their eyes. He didn't press them with questions. Instead, he let them eat in peace, giving them time to regain some of the energy they had lost during their long, harrowing journey. After breakfast, John suggested they step outside for a few minutes to feel the sunlight and stretch their legs. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked carefully across the frozen ground. The girls marveled at the way the light reflected off the snow, their eyes wide with wonder. They had spent days traveling in fear and exhaustion, and the simple beauty of the plains seemed almost magical to them. John watched them closely, impressed by their resilience despite their young age. Even in the midst of danger, they carried themselves with quiet dignity and strength. As they walked, John asked gentle questions about where they had come from, who their family might be, and how they had survived the harsh conditions. The sisters were cautious at first, speaking in short sentences, but as the morning passed, they began to share fragments of their story. Their village had been small and peaceful, but a group of raiders had attacked, forcing everyone to flee. The girls had become separated from their parents in the chaos and had been wandering the plains ever since, looking for safety. The journey had been terrifying, filled with hunger, cold, and constant fear. John listened with empathy, never interrupting or judging. He understood more than he let on, for he had lived his entire life on the edge of the wilderness and had witnessed the hardships of survival firsthand. Yet he also recognized something remarkable in these young girls, a quiet determination that refused to let fear define them. Despite everything they had endured, they still moved forward, searching for hope, for safety, for a chance to survive. By midday, John led the girls back inside, where the fire continued to burn warmly. He offered them water and a little more food, and then he suggested they rest while he tended to the ranch chores. The girls curled up on the blanket, their small bodies finally relaxing in the comfort of safety. John went outside to check on his cattle, his thoughts returning again and again to the two sisters. He felt a mixture of admiration, concern, and something he had not experienced in a long time, protectiveness. As he worked, he thought about the precariousness of their situation. The plains were unforgiving, especially in winter. Wolves and coyotes prowled the outskirts looking for food. The snow made travel difficult, and the cold could be deadly if shelter and warmth were not found. Yet John also knew that despite these dangers, the girls had shown extraordinary courage simply by surviving this long. Their determination had saved them from situations that would have overwhelmed many adults, and he realized that helping them was not just an act of kindness. It was a duty, a way to ensure that their bravery did not go unrewarded. Later in the afternoon, John returned to the cabin, finding the girls awake and staring out the window. They had noticed movement in the distance, though they did not yet understand what it might mean. John knelt beside them, keeping his voice calm. "Don't worry," he said. "It's probably just the wind moving the trees. Nothing to be afraid of." The girls nodded, but their hands clutched the blanket tightly, a sign that fear was still close to the surface. John didn't press the matter. He knew that fear could only be eased with patience, warmth, and trust. As the day wore on, the sisters began to open up a little more. They told John about the traditions of their people, about the songs they sang to comfort each other at night, and about the stories their parents had shared with them before the raid. John listened intently, fascinated by the richness of their culture and the wisdom in their words. Despite their youth, the girls spoke with a depth that surprised him, reflecting the lessons they had learned in a world far harsher than most could imagine. Evening approached, and the cold began to seep back into the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. John stoked the fire, careful to keep it burning brightly through the night. The sisters huddled together under the blanket, leaning on each other for warmth. They spoke softly, their voices mingling with the crackling of the fire. John watched them, feeling a growing sense of responsibility. He had given them shelter, warmth, and food, but he knew that the true challenge was not over. The plains were vast, and danger could appear at any moment. He resolved silently that he would not let harm come to them while they were under his care. As the night deepened, John found himself reflecting on his own life. He had spent many years alone, focused on the land and his cattle, never imagining that he would suddenly be responsible for two young lives. Yet the experience filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. In protecting them, in offering them comfort, he realized that life's true measure was not wealth or solitude, but the impact one could have on others, especially those most in need. The girls, sensing the sincerity in John's care, began to trust him more fully. They spoke of their fears, of the loneliness they had endured, and of the moments when hope had seemed lost. John listened quietly, never interrupting, offering only comfort and understanding. He told them stories of his own childhood on the plains, of hardships he had faced, and of lessons learned in the face of adversity. The girls listened with rapt attention, finding in his words a sense of reassurance that they had not felt in weeks. Night fell fully, and the cabin grew quiet except for the steady crackle of the fire. The girls finally fell asleep, their bodies relaxed and their breathing calm. John stayed awake for a while longer, keeping watch over them. He thought about what the next day might bring, aware that the plains were unpredictable and that help could come or danger could arrive, without warning. Still, he felt a quiet optimism. He had done what he could, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that small acts of kindness could indeed make a difference. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the snow drifted across the plains. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, safety, and the beginnings of trust between a stranger and two young girls who had known little comfort in recent days. John knew that the night ahead would be critical, that their survival depended not just on warmth and food, but on the quiet vigilance he maintained. And as he watched the girls sleep, he realized that sometimes, even in the harshest conditions, courage and kindness could create a sanctuary, a place where hope could survive against all odds. By the end of the night, John felt a bond forming, fragile yet real. He understood that these two sisters were more than just survivors. They were a reminder of resilience, of strength, and of the human spirit's ability to endure even in the harshest circumstances. He had shared his only blanket with them, but in doing so, he had received something far greater, the knowledge that compassion could bridge gaps of fear, loneliness, and uncertainty. The morning would bring new challenges, but for now, they were safe. They had warmth, food, shelter, and a guardian who cared deeply for their well-being. The bond formed in that small cabin was unspoken but powerful, rooted in mutual trust and the quiet understanding that sometimes life demanded courage not just to survive, but to give when one had little to give. As dawn approached, John stepped outside for a moment, looking across the snow-covered plains. He wondered what lay ahead, aware that the sisters' journey was far from over. Yet he felt a sense of peace knowing that for one night at least, they had been protected from the cold, the hunger, and the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. Inside the cabin, the girls slept soundly, their faces softened by rest, their spirits lifted by the warmth of the blanket and the kindness of a man they had only just met. And in that quiet moment, John understood something essential. That acts of compassion, no matter how small, could ripple far beyond what one could see. He had shared his only blanket, but in return, he had created safety, trust, and a fragile hope that might one day grow into something enduring. The sisters' story was still unfolding, and though danger and uncertainty waited beyond the cabin walls, for now there was a fragile peace, a moment of humanity shining brightly against the harshness of the plains. The night had passed quietly in John's cabin, but the wind outside remained relentless, sweeping across the plains with a biting chill. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, settling on the frozen ground and trees, making the world outside appear calm yet treacherous. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The two sisters had slept soundly for the first time in days, their faces soft with rest, their bodies finally free from the constant trembling of fear and cold. John stirred early, as he did every morning, stacking firewood and tending to the small stove that was their only source of warmth. He had kept the blanket wrapped around the girls through the night, sharing it himself as needed to ensure they stayed warm. As he looked out the window, scanning the vast expanse of white plains, he felt a subtle tension in the air. There was something different about that morning, a faint sense that their lives were about to change, though he could not yet tell how. The girls awoke slowly, rubbing their eyes and stretching their stiff limbs. They looked healthier than the day before, the warmth of the fire and the blanket having restored some of their energy. John handed them each a piece of bread and a little water, and they ate quietly, listening to the wind outside and the soft creaking of the cabin. There was a sense of routine in their morning, a rhythm of survival that had begun to form between them and John. Yet as the morning wore on, subtle signs began to emerge that something unusual was approaching. John noticed faint tracks in the snow outside, too large and organized to belong to a deer or wolf. The patterns suggested many people moving together, their direction heading straight toward the cabin. He felt a mixture of curiosity and caution. The plains were home to both friends and foes, and the sudden appearance of strangers could mean anything, from travelers in need of help to a group with hostile intentions. He decided to remain calm, not wanting to alarm the girls. He led them to the window and whispered gently, "Do you see those tracks? Something is coming, but I don't know who they are yet. Stay here and keep warm. Don't worry, we'll face this together." The girls clutched the blanket tightly, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. John could see the questions in their faces, the silent wonder of what lay ahead. Hours passed and the wind carried a distant sound, a rhythmic thumping, the faint echo of hooves against the frozen earth. The sound grew steadily louder, sending a shiver through the cabin. John stepped outside for a better view, shielding his eyes against the glinting snow. In the distance, he could make out movement, a line of figures riding across the plains, their silhouettes sharp against the pale morning sky. There were too many to count from this distance, but he sensed immediately that it was a large group and that they were purposeful in their movement. His heart quickened. He did not yet know their intentions, but instinctively he felt that the girls needed protection more than ever. He returned to the cabin, shutting the door carefully and pulling the blanket tighter around the sisters. "It's okay," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Whatever happens, we'll handle it together. Just stay close and stay quiet." The girls nodded, trusting him completely, their fear mingled with the curiosity of finally seeing others after so long in isolation. The figures drew nearer, and John could now make out the details of their approach. They were mounted on horses, their movements precise and disciplined. As they came closer still, he noticed the markings on their faces and the colorful patterns of their clothing. His breath caught in his throat as he realized that these were not ordinary travelers. They were Apache warriors, mounted in a disciplined formation, their faces painted in traditional designs. The girls stiffened beside him, recognizing their own people, though they had not seen the warriors before. John's mind raced. He did not know what to expect. Would the warriors be angry, or would they understand why he had taken care of their young? The girls leaned against him for reassurance, their trust giving him strength. The horses drew closer, and soon 300 warriors surrounded the cabin, creating a circle that seemed both protective and imposing. The sight was breathtaking and intimidating, the power of so many people, their synchronized movements, and the intensity in their eyes. Yet there was a calm in their presence, a sense that they were not there to harm, but to witness. The Apache chief, an older man with a commanding presence, stepped forward. His face was lined with age and experience, his eyes sharp yet thoughtful. He spoke to John in a language he did not understand at first, but the tone was respectful, almost reverent. One of the younger warriors stepped forward to translate, explaining that the chief wished to speak with the man who had shown kindness to the sisters. John listened, his heart pounding with a mixture of awe and anxiety. He realized with relief that the warriors were not hostile. The chief explained that in their culture, acts of kindness toward the young and vulnerable were highly honored. The sisters had returned to their people, and the tribe had come to meet the man who had given them warmth, safety, and comfort when they were alone and exposed to the elements. John felt a mixture of humility and astonishment. He had acted out of simple compassion, never imagining that it would result in such a significant gathering. The warriors began to circle the cabin slowly, observing John and the sisters. Their expressions were serious but not threatening. Gifts were brought forward, bundles of food, blankets, and tools, symbols of their gratitude. John was overwhelmed. He had only shared what little he had, yet the warriors' response was grand, their honor and appreciation evident in every gesture. The sisters, now standing with their people, looked at John with pride and gratitude, their bond strengthened by the act that had brought them together. John spoke quietly to the chief, explaining that he had acted out of concern and could not bear to see the children suffer. The chief nodded, understanding perfectly. In the Apache tradition, such acts were not measured by wealth or status but by the sincerity of the heart. John realized then that his simple choice, to give his only blanket to two frightened sisters, had transcended cultural boundaries and had earned him the respect of an entire community. As the morning unfolded, John spent time with the warriors, learning about their customs, their way of life, and the deep respect they held for one another and for acts of kindness. The sisters were nearby, laughing softly as they spoke with their friends and family. John could see the joy in their faces, a joy born not only from reunion, but from the reassurance that they were no longer alone in a harsh and dangerous world. The experience was transformative. John felt a connection to the tribe, a sense of belonging he had not known in his years of solitude. He realized that human kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways that one could never anticipate. His actions, born of compassion, had created trust, respect, and a bridge between two very different worlds. The warrior's presence was a reminder that courage and generosity were recognized across boundaries, and that simple acts of care could inspire gratitude and honor in ways that were both profound and lasting. Throughout the day, the sisters shared stories of their journey with John, filling in details that had remained untold during the cold nights and anxious mornings. They spoke of the fear and uncertainty they had faced, of the nights spent huddled together in the wilderness, and of the moment they first saw John's cabin in the distance. John listened, deeply moved by their courage, understanding more than ever the significance of the small gestures that had kept them alive. By evening, the warriors had departed, leaving John and the sisters alone once more. Yet something fundamental had changed. The world outside the cabin now seemed less frightening, less lonely. John knew that the bonds formed that day would endure, and that the memory of the warriors' arrival, and the respect and gratitude that came with it, would remain with him forever. The sisters, too, carried with them a renewed sense of safety, a knowledge that the kindness of one stranger had connected them to their people and preserved their lives. As John settled in for the night, the blanket once again wrapped around the sisters, he reflected on the events of the day. He had faced uncertainty and fear, yet his choices had led to an outcome far greater than he could have imagined. The plains remained vast and cold, but the warmth of human connection, the courage to care, the willingness to act, had created a sanctuary within the wilderness. And as the fire flickered and the wind howled outside, John knew that the lessons of that day would stay with him forever. That trust, kindness, and courage could transform even the coldest and harshest landscapes into places of hope and safety. The morning after the warriors' arrival was quiet but charged with a sense of significance. John Miller woke early, as he always did, but this time the cabin felt different. The warmth of the fire seemed heavier with meaning, and the silence was filled with memories of the previous day's extraordinary events. Outside, the plain stretched endlessly, glittering with frost and snow, yet John's mind was not on the cold. He thought of the faces of the Apache warriors, the quiet dignity of their chief, and most of all, the trust and gratitude reflected in the eyes of the two sisters. The girls had slept soundly, their bodies finally free from the tension and exhaustion that had weighed on them for weeks. When they awoke, they moved with a sense of purpose and lightness, their eyes shining with the joy of being with someone who had cared for them without question. John had prepared a modest breakfast of bread, dried fruit, and a little warmed water, and the sisters ate eagerly, the simple meal seeming like a feast to them. They spoke quietly about the events of the previous day, their voices tinged with awe as they recounted the arrival of the warriors and the respect they had shown toward John. John listened carefully, humbled by their words. He had acted without thought of recognition or reward, driven only by the desire to provide warmth and safety. Yet the honor and gratitude expressed by the Apache were profound, far beyond anything he could have imagined. He realized that even small acts of kindness could have ripple effects far greater than the original intent, connecting people across cultures and lives in ways that were both surprising and deeply meaningful. Later in the morning, the chief and a few of the warriors returned to the cabin, bringing with them gifts and tokens of appreciation. There were bundles of blankets, each carefully folded and tied, handmade tools for John to use on the ranch, and food to sustain the small household through the coming days. John accepted the gifts with humility, deeply moved by their generosity and thoughtfulness. He understood that these gestures were not merely ceremonial. They were symbols of respect, a way for the Apache to express their gratitude in a manner that honored both their traditions and the human connection that had been formed. The chief spoke to John at length, sharing stories of his people, their history, and the values that guided their lives. He explained that courage and compassion were treasured qualities among the Apache, and that acts of selflessness, such as protecting and providing for those in need, were regarded with the highest esteem. John listened, absorbing the lessons and realizing that the world was far larger and more interconnected than he had ever imagined. In saving the sisters, he had not only ensured their survival, but had also earned a place of respect within a community that valued integrity, bravery, and kindness above all else. The sisters, meanwhile, moved freely among the warriors, showing them the confidence that had grown within them after their night in John's cabin. They laughed softly, their voices carrying the lightness of youth and the relief of safety. John watched them with a mixture of pride and amazement. The girls had endured so much, yet their spirits remained unbroken. They were learning, in the warmth and trust of the cabin and through the interactions with their people, that courage was not just about survival. It was about trust, hope, and the bonds formed with those who cared. As the day unfolded, John began to participate in the daily routines of the Apache community. The warriors demonstrated how they hunted, cared for their horses, and navigated the harsh plains. John absorbed these lessons with humility and respect, recognizing that survival required skill, awareness, and cooperation. The sisters joined him, their laughter and curiosity bridging the gap between two worlds. Together they learned, shared, and grew, creating bonds that transcended language and culture. Evening arrived, bringing with it a quiet, reflective moment. John and the sisters sat together outside the cabin, wrapped in blankets and watching the sun dip behind the snow-covered plains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows over the white landscape. John thought about the events of the past days, the fear, the cold, the uncertainty, and finally, the warmth, trust, and honor that had emerged. He understood that this was more than just survival. It was a lesson in humanity, showing that acts of compassion could inspire courage, respect, and connection in ways he had never anticipated. The chief returned once more, this time with a solemn yet kind expression. He spoke to John in his own language, the words heavy with meaning. One of the warriors translated carefully, explaining that John's actions had been remembered and would be honored among the tribe for generations. The chief presented John with a special token, a small, intricately carved item that symbolized respect, trust, and gratitude. John accepted it with deep humility, feeling the weight of the honor and the responsibility it represented. The sisters, standing nearby, watched silently. They understood that the man who had given them warmth and safety was being acknowledged not for his possessions or status, but for his courage, his heart, and his willingness to care for others in need. Their bond with John had grown stronger, rooted in trust, shared experiences, and the realization that true kindness required no expectation of reward. That night, as John sat by the fire with the sisters wrapped in the blanket, he reflected on the profound lessons he had learned. He thought about the power of small acts, the ways in which compassion could ripple outward, and the strength that could be found in human connection. The plains outside remained cold and vast, but within the cabin there was warmth, safety, and a sense of purpose. He understood that the gift of kindness was reciprocal. In giving, he had received something far greater than material goods: respect, trust, and the knowledge that he had made a meaningful difference in the lives of others. The sisters, exhausted but content, leaned against John and listened as he told stories of his life on the ranch, of winters past and the lessons he had learned from the land. They asked questions, their curiosity boundless, and John answered patiently, weaving in lessons of resilience, respect, and courage. The fire crackled softly, the wind whispered outside, and within the small cabin, a sense of peace and connection settled over them. As days passed, the bond between John and the Apache community deepened. The warriors returned occasionally, checking on the girls and offering guidance. They shared knowledge of the land, survival techniques, and cultural stories that enriched John's understanding of the world around him. The sisters thrived in this environment, growing stronger and more confident, their smiles and laughter reflecting the security they felt. John, in turn, learned the importance of community, the power of gratitude, and the lasting impact of compassion. John also began to notice subtle changes in himself. He felt a renewed sense of purpose and joy, understanding that the simplest gestures, offering warmth, protection, and care, could create ripples that transformed lives. The harshness of the plains seemed less daunting, and the isolation that had once been his constant companion now felt less lonely. He had discovered a connection to others, a reminder that no one truly lived in isolation when acts of kindness and trust bridged the gaps between hearts. The sisters spoke often of their parents, of the family they had been separated from, and John listened, offering comfort and encouragement. He reminded them of their strength, their courage, and the remarkable journey that had brought them through hardship to safety. The sisters began to understand that family could extend beyond blood, that trust, care, and shared experience could form bonds just as powerful as those of birth. John became a guardian, mentor, and friend, a living reminder of the goodness that existed in the world even amid fear and adversity. The Apache community, too, embraced John in small but meaningful ways. They taught him to respect their traditions, to understand their customs, and to see the world through a lens of honor and reciprocity. Each lesson reinforced the idea that true courage and compassion were recognized not by material wealth or status, but by the heart and the willingness to act in defense of what was right. John absorbed these lessons, knowing they would remain with him for the rest of his life. By the end of the week, the bond between John, the sisters, and the Apache community had solidified. The plains remained vast and harsh, the winters unforgiving, Yet within the circle of trust and respect that had formed, there was warmth, safety, and hope. John knew that his actions had changed more than the course of a single night. They had forged connections, inspired gratitude, and strengthened the spirits of those involved in ways that would echo for years to come. As night fell over the snow-covered plains, John wrapped the sisters in blankets and watched the stars appear in the clear, cold sky. He thought about the extraordinary events that had unfolded, the fear, the cold, the arrival of the warriors, and the honor they had shown. The lessons were clear. Courage could be quiet, acts of kindness could create lasting impact, and the bonds of trust and respect could bridge even the widest gaps between worlds. In that moment, John felt a profound sense of peace. The sisters were safe. The Apache had shown their gratitude and respect, and he had discovered a deeper understanding of humanity and honor. The plains outside were still vast and untamed, but inside the cabin, warmth and connection had transformed the harsh landscape into a place of hope and meaning. John knew that these experiences would shape his life forever. He had learned that even the simplest acts, sharing a blanket, offering warmth, listening with empathy, could carry immense significance. The sisters, strengthened by their journey and the kindness they had received, would carry these lessons with them, and the memory of their connection with John would remain a guiding force in their lives. And so, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, John, the sisters, and the memory of the Apache warrior's honor settled into a quiet rhythm. It was a rhythm of trust, courage, and humanity, a rhythm that would continue to guide them all as they faced the future, no matter how harsh or uncertain the plains might be. The mornings on the plains had become less harsh for John Miller. The sun rose over the snow-covered fields with a quiet brilliance, and for the first time in weeks, John felt a sense of hope that went beyond mere survival. The two sisters, now comfortable in the cabin and growing stronger each day, moved with confidence and curiosity, their spirits lifted by the warmth, safety, and care they had found with him. Yet John knew that life on the plains remained unpredictable. The vastness of the land offered both beauty and danger, and while today might be calm, tomorrow could bring uncertainty. The sisters had begun to explore their surroundings more freely, guided by John's careful instructions. They learned how to gather firewood, how to check the small herd of cattle, and even how to recognize signs in the snow that hinted at approaching animals or people. John watched them with a mixture of pride and awe. They had endured so much already, yet they absorbed each new lesson with eagerness and courage. Their laughter filled the cabin and the surrounding area, a bright contrast to the harsh, white wilderness that stretched beyond the fences. One morning, while the girls were playing near the cabin, John noticed tracks in the snow that were different from the usual animal trails. They were human tracks, deep and purposeful, heading straight toward his cabin. He felt a familiar tension in his chest, a reminder that life on the plains demanded constant vigilance. The girls noticed his expression and ran to his side, their trust in him unshaken. "It's okay," he said gently. "Let's see who it is. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." As the figures emerged from the snow-covered horizon, John saw once more the disciplined movement of the Apache warriors. There were fewer than the 300 who had arrived weeks earlier, but they carried the same quiet dignity, their faces painted, their movements purposeful. The girls recognized their people immediately, and a sense of excitement and pride lit their faces. John felt a surge of gratitude for the connection that had formed between him and the tribe. He had never imagined that such a simple act, sharing a blanket, could create a bond so profound. The chief approached with the same solemn authority as before. He spoke to John through the translator, expressing the tribe's continuing gratitude. The warriors had returned to offer guidance, to strengthen the bond between John and their people, and to ensure the girls were safe and prepared for the future. John felt humbled by the respect shown to him. He had acted without expectation, driven only by compassion, yet the response had been overwhelming in its honor and generosity. Over the next few days, John spent time with the warriors, learning more about their traditions, skills, and ways of life. He observed their methods for surviving the harsh winter, hunting in the plains, and caring for their horses. The sisters joined him, eager to participate, their laughter echoing through the snow-covered landscape. John marveled at their resilience. The girls had endured loss, fear, and exhaustion, yet here they were, embracing life with energy and curiosity. He realized that their courage was contagious. It inspired him to see the world with renewed appreciation and respect. The chief often spoke with John about the importance of honor, compassion, and community. He explained that actions, even those that seemed small or ordinary, carried weight and could ripple across time and distance. John understood deeply what he had experienced firsthand. The act of sharing his only blanket had created trust, respect, and connections that reached far beyond his own cabin. It had brought a tribe together, inspired gratitude, and preserved the lives of two brave young girls. One afternoon, the chief suggested a small ceremony to honor John's actions formally. The warriors gathered around the cabin, their faces painted, their presence calm yet commanding. The sisters stood beside John, holding his hands and looking up at him with admiration and love. The chief presented him with gifts, blankets, tools, and food, as tokens of the tribe's respect. John accepted them with humility, aware that the real gift was not in the items themselves, but in the acknowledgement of courage, kindness, and humanity. The girls were given a special place in the ceremony. The chief spoke to them of bravery, resilience, and the importance of family and community. He reminded them that while the plains could be harsh and unforgiving, the bonds of trust and care could offer protection and strength. John watched as the sisters listened attentively, their eyes wide with understanding and pride. He realized that these lessons would remain with them forever, shaping their lives in ways that went beyond mere survival. Even after the ceremony, the bond between John and the Apache community continued to grow. Warriors returned periodically to teach survival skills, share stories, and strengthen connections. The sisters thrived under this care, learning the customs of their people while remaining grounded in the trust they had built with John. The cabin, once just a simple shelter against the cold, had become a place of learning, growth, and profound human connection. John reflected often on the journey that had brought them here. He thought of the bitter cold, the long nights of uncertainty, and the fear that had once filled the cabin. He remembered the moment he had wrapped the sisters in his only blanket and the quiet hope he had felt as they slept safely beside him. That single act, driven by compassion and empathy, had set into motion a series of events that transformed lives and created lasting bonds. John understood, perhaps for the first time, that the value of life was measured not in possessions, but in the courage to care for others, even when doing so meant risking one's own comfort. As winter turned to early spring, the snow began to melt, revealing patches of green in the plains. The air grew warmer, carrying the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings. The sisters had grown stronger, their spirits unbroken, and John felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had learned from them as much as they had learned from him, the strength of resilience, the importance of trust, and the transformative power of kindness. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, John and the sisters sat outside the cabin. They watched the colors of the sky change, from golden orange to deep purple, and listened to the quiet sounds of the plains. John spoke to the girls about the lessons he hoped they would carry with them: courage in the face of fear, the power of compassion, and the understanding that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple far beyond what one could imagine. The girls listened intently, their faces glowing with the soft light of the fading sun. The chief returned one last time to check on them. He spoke of continued gratitude and assured John that the bond between him and the tribe would remain strong. He emphasized that the girls were now connected to a community that valued their safety, growth, and well-being, and that John's actions had ensured a future filled with support and respect. John felt a profound sense of peace. The plains, once daunting and lonely, had become a landscape filled with warmth, connection, and hope. In the days that followed, John and the sisters continued their routines, tending to the cattle, maintaining the cabin, and learning from the Apache warriors whenever they visited. The sisters had grown in skill, confidence, and understanding, while John had grown in empathy, patience, and appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit. Together, they had navigated fear, uncertainty, and hardship, and emerged stronger, bound by trust and shared experiences that would endure for a lifetime. Eventually, John realized that the story of the blanket, the simple act of sharing warmth with two frightened girls, would remain with him forever. It had become more than a memory. It was a symbol of humanity, courage, and the power of connection. The sisters, too, carried this lesson in their hearts, understanding that safety and care often came from unexpected places, and that gratitude and respect were as vital as survival itself. As the sun rose each morning and set each evening, John looked across the plains and saw the beauty in the vast, open world. He thought about how a small act, given without expectation, could transform lives, create bonds, and inspire respect. The cabin, the blanket, and the shared moments with the sisters had become a sanctuary, a place where fear was replaced by hope, and loneliness was replaced by trust and connection. The sisters thrived, their laughter echoing across the plains, their spirits strong and resilient. They had survived fear, cold, and uncertainty, and in doing so, they had learned the value of courage, kindness, and trust. John watched them grow, proud not only of their physical strength, but of the strength of their hearts and spirits. He knew that their journey had just begun, yet they were ready to face the world with the confidence and wisdom they had gained. The Apache warriors' visits became a reminder of the lasting connections forged through compassion. John understood that these bonds were not fleeting. They would endure, carrying the lessons of respect, courage, and kindness forward. The plains, once intimidating and empty, now seemed alive with possibility, filled with stories of bravery and humanity. One cold evening, John sat by the fire with the sisters wrapped in blankets. He reflected on the long journey that had begun with a simple act of generosity. The wind howled outside, but inside there was warmth, safety, and the enduring lesson that one person's courage and kindness could change the lives of many. The sisters, now safe, strong, and happy, slept peacefully, their hearts filled with trust and gratitude. John knew that the plains would always remain vast and unpredictable, but he also knew that their lives had been forever changed for the better. In the end, John understood the true power of his actions. The blanket, once a simple object of comfort, had become a symbol of hope, compassion, and human connection. The sisters' lives had been saved, a tribe had honored a stranger's courage, and John had discovered the profound impact that one act of kindness could have. The plains remained wild and untamed, but within them, a story of generosity, trust, and resilience had taken root, one that would be remembered by all who had witnessed it. And so, life on the plains continued. John, the sisters, and the memory of the Apache warriors' honor endured, a testament to the enduring power of kindness, courage, and human connection. The snow melted, the seasons changed, and the plains remained vast, but the warmth created that winter, through a single blanket and a brave act of heart, would never fade. It had become a legacy, a reminder that in the coldest and harshest of places, humanity, generosity, and courage could shine brighter than the harshest winter sun.